I think there are certainly areas where AI is going to take people's jobs. I think in the short term, the biggest problem is that people who use AI are going to take people who don't use AI's jobs. And and so become a person that uses AI, and then you won't have that problem.
Peter, why don't you introduce yourself?
I'm Peteris Erins. I'm the founder of Auditless, and we're a crypto boutique consultancy, and we've been operating since 2018. How I got into that is I started in software engineering internships in California, did the sort of very, very old school version of machine learning. We were using classifiers and stuff at Twitter, and then moved into management consulting. After graduating, I was doing McKinsey in London for a couple of years as a journalist consultant. And then when they acquired Quantum Black, moved over into a product role there. That's where we met and worked together. Quit in 2018 to join crypto and start Auditless. And since then, we've been kind of doing different types of projects. We've been doing sort of strategy work and implementation work. Always a mix of kind of having both the strategic mindset and the sort of deeply technical mindset as well.
Yeah, can you double click a little bit on the crypto piece, because I think the generalist understanding is Bitcoin, right? But that's not specifically what you consult on, is it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think at Quantum Black, the thing that I really enjoyed working on was developer tooling and open source software. So I had the privilege of working on Kedro, which then later was open sourced, and that's actually the reason I joined crypto. It wasn't necessarily for sort of the gold alternative and the cryptocurrencies. It was actually because I was just really curious about how these smart contracts work. And then the more I got into it, I got excited about what they could be used for. And so specifically, I started with very low level kind of work there. So smart contracts are, the thing that basically powers new cryptocurrencies, the thing that can power more complicated financial instruments, like prediction markets, like exchanges, like lending protocols. It basically allows you to create this financial layer where all you really need to do to create a financial product, you don't need, lawyers, you don't need suits, you don't need all these things. All you need to do is basically write a piece of code and deploy it into that financial layer. And of course, it's taken very interesting, different directions, through the years. But that's kind of the essence of what got me excited.
Nice. And I think recently Auditless has been exploring AI more broadly as well, right? As a problem space.
Yeah, there's been a bunch of moving forces. One of them has been just using AI internally more and more in our projects, specifically in development work, but also beyond that in research as well, quite a bit. The other moving force has been I have a newsletter that I write every week. And my guiding principle for how I write the newsletter is basically I'll just write whatever I'm actually interested about. And this is something I learned in way back in high school. I had to write this like extended essay, which is kind of like a research piece. And I was spending a whole week trying to figure out what the topic should be. And I was procrastinating by studying a specific data structure for competitive programming. And I was like, wait a second, why don't I make that the thing? And that worked out pretty well. I got pretty good grades and ended up in some national competitions for research pieces. So that's the lesson I took from that. And so the newsletter is always what I'm actually reading about and thinking about that week. And what I've found is like we used to be sort of 80% crypto, 20% other stuff, and now we've flipped and we're writing 80% about AI. So those have been sort of the moving forces. And so yeah, we're actually expanding to work with companies outside of crypto. So private equities were kind of a focus area right now, where we're talking to a portfolio, a bunch of them, and getting to know the CEOs and kind of digging into their problems. It's like pretty early stage. We're figuring things out, but we're going to take our offerings, which is the strategy and implementation side, and kind of move them and apply them much more broadly. Specifically kind of what we've done before on the strategy side has been things like everything from just protocol strategy. So figuring out what products to launch, how to go to market, things like that, all the way to narrative strategy for smaller companies. So maybe just figuring out how they should present themselves, how they should pitch to investors and things like that. And on the implementation side, we've done really much work of technical projects, everything from developer tooling, security tooling, and also smart contracts over the years, of course. Since 2020, smart contracts have been kind of the major thing.
What problems are you seeing? Like if their general adoption or reticence about adopting this technology isn't there, like what problems do you see that you think Auditless is going to end up playing a role in solving?
it's sort of funny when I contrast crypto and private equity. My observation is that in crypto, you have these incredibly talented, incredibly technical people with these incredible products working in a market that is very, very challenging, right? And part of the challenge of the market has been it's not been a market which has been good at bringing in revenue from the outside, right? It's been a market where people have created synthetic assets. Those assets have assumed value through speculation, and then people have a lot of revenue has been basically coordinated around the valuations of those assets, right? So somebody creates an asset, there's a valuation on that asset, and then somebody creates an exchange where people can trade that asset, and now they're making revenue, right? But that revenue is effectively predicated on the speculation on the asset. So I think crypto always had that problem, versus in private equity, it's the opposite. People are in real markets. They have all these niches that are really interesting. They don't have good competition in those niches. But in terms of technical capability, it's a lot lower. In terms of AI adoption, it's a lot lower. And I think it's a fantastic place to be, because ultimately, when you're already making money and you have a company that's basically working, there's just so many opportunities to apply AI. It's taken me with some CEOs, it's like 10 minutes and we already have the first program, and it's just like, okay, here's what you should do. And by the way, you probably don't need my help. I'm just going to send you a couple of URLs. Just you have one developer, that's using Claude. Great. Go ahead and do that.
Yeah. Can you give me a couple of examples?
Yeah. So we had one with customer support where a company was saying it takes them 4 to 5 days to basically respond to customer support tickets. They had 2 people managing those tickets, and some of the delays just came from the fact that they have to dig into specific software configuration. So the software actually, customers create their own configurations, they create their own forms effectively in the software. And so to debug issues, you have to kind of go in and log in as them and kind of figure out, what's going wrong. And is it their problem of understanding, or is it an actual bug? And so that requires, the support teams to do a little bit of that. And then sometimes they get stuck and then they have to wait for the developers to help. And so it's like a whole complicated thing. But it was very interesting because the company was already using Claude Code. So developers were using Claude Code, but the support team wasn't. And so I was like, well, that's interesting, because I think support is actually easier than coding, right? Because the same things just come up all the time. Versus in coding, when you build one feature, you're sort of looking, to the next one. And so my recommendation to them was well, first of all, give your support team Claude Code, right? Don't worry about, and I think they had a little bit of reticence around being worried that, okay, we don't want to replace our support team with a chatbot, right? Because we don't want to, but that's not, you don't need to go that far. All you need to do is actually just give your support team a draft of a great answer. And then most of the time it's going to be fine, right? They're going to press send. And some of the times it's not going to be fine, but it's still going to save them some of the time. And then all you need to do on top of that to enable Claude to be a great support agent is just a little bit of, configuration around tone and voice, and some ability to learn from past tickets and improve over time. And then some ability to actually access these customer configurations and basically log in as the customer, right? And so that's pretty easy too, because all you need to do, you create a terminal interface, plug it into the API, create a view-only interface, write a skill explaining to Claude how you access that, and wow, you have a support agent. So that was my recommendation to them. And I actually ended up prototyping and build, because I was like, well, this is actually sounds pretty interesting. I wonder how this could work. And my last newsletter is actually exactly about building this customer support agent and testing it out, and it does work.
Do you? I think it's a fascinating space, right? There's obviously got a lot of massive players in it in terms of, like Sierra and other companies that are commoditizing kind of this support agent space. Rolling out across call centers and all these sorts of things. Do you, what's your reflection on that necessarily being something that is a defensible moat? Do what you've just described there is a custom build that didn't take a lot of time or energy, and then suddenly this company's got something up and running. Where do you see the line there?
Yeah, definitely. So, this is actually something where I was pretty honest with them that, there's really very little value that I'm offering, and they should just do it. And I explained exactly how to do it. And then I built a kind of open sourceable version of this agent as well for similar reasons. I think what we're really excited about is doing 2 things. One is finding a way, kind of like finding what the future of strategy consulting is. So I think the future of strategy consulting isn't exactly sort of the MBB approach. I think it's a lot more real time. I think it's a lot more being aware of data, both internal and external. And I think it's not structured in, 2-month projects that take a lot of coordination to figure out what the project should be about. I think strategy should sort of be this ongoing thing that just happens. And so that's what we're trying to explore for the strategy side of things. And then on the implementation side, we actually don't care that it's the easier it is for us to recommend a playbook or to recommend a tool, we'll recommend it, right? The point is that the problem that actually exists is that people don't know which customer support tool they should install, or they don't know how to configure it, or they don't know should they build it themselves or should they install it, or so on. And those are all the things we'd want to advise people on to help them take that on that journey. So I think it's going to be actually where we're going to build software is on the strategy side, and then build a lot of playbooks on the implementation side.
Interesting. So you're productizing the service, the consulting, rather than the end result execution, the thing that they end up having to build and implement. Okay, fascinating. How about your own personal exploration, right? You're one of the most tech-leaning product managers that I've ever worked with, and also an engineer at the same time. Like, where, how is AI changing the way that you work personally?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because it's sort of like imagine a transition from traditional mining, where people had to go down in the mines and do the work themselves, to machinery-based mining. And then you ask a person who's sitting in a machine, like, how's your work changed? And they're just like, well, it's like, I'm not even this is not even the same. Like, I can't even call this the same work. It's like fundamentally different work that you're doing, right? So I think that would be the biggest kind of framing change for me, is just like, I don't even think it's the same work that I'm doing anymore. I think, and we have to move past that. But yeah, of course. So, I mean, across, so I'd say two things. So one is it's sort of, definitely made me more productive in these, all these obvious ways. I personally use a mix of AI across research and coding the most. And then I use some AI on generative stuff, such as images and videos that I've experimented with. I think images are a lot easier. I'm impressed by people who can conquer video. I think it's quite complicated. I think, there's still room for taste and all that, and good workflow practices. And, it's also changed how I work with people in the team, because we also have people using AI. So it's actually, it's a different thing to manage people who are using AI than to manage developers who are not using AI, right? Because you have all these interesting aspects of figuring out what your context file should look like. How are you gonna you're arguing about all the frameworks that you should be using and best practices. A lot of times, sometimes you get caught reviewing something where it's like, well, I'm actually not reviewing something that's been reviewed by a human before. I'm reviewing something that's just been, so like, and because the team is doing much more, now you have to review a lot more stuff. And so now you're going to be like, okay, well, should I be using agents to kind of add leverage to my review process? Because otherwise I'm the same, I'm still one person reviewing all this stuff. Now I'm reviewing like 3 or 5 times the work. So I think it's been an incredible challenge to kind of adapt to that. But we've been able to do it in a very difficult domain, which is smart contracts. I think the most challenging thing we've had to kind of overcome is that, smart contracts just got to be right. So it's sort of the worst place to be vibe coding, right? Because if you make a mistake, you're going to lose a lot of money. And we've built contracts from the ground up that manage over $100 million in capital, and that's a scary place to be. And you need to find ways to sleep at night somehow. And so we've found and kind of built processes around making sure that we can use AI to speed us up, but without compromising quality. So that's been a big win. And then I think on a more strategic level, AI has completely changed about how I think we should be building the company, like what moats are and so on. In fact, one of the reasons why we started focusing on writing a newsletter was actually way back in 2023 with the GPT moment. That's where, even though I wasn't necessarily using as much AI that I was, then, that I am now, it was just clear that the value of software is going to zero. And so immediately I was like, well, I can't value, A is like a little bit of an identity crisis for someone who's spent a lot of years trying to be good at software. I'm just like, okay, this is not, not a good way to sort of, value myself as an individual based on that skill. But then like figuring out, yeah, what is the moat now? And I think there are some really interesting and sophisticated moats that like we have to find out. But I felt comfort knowing, okay, distribution is something that, okay, maybe it's not becoming like more important, but it's certainly not becoming less important. There's 7 billion people on the planet. If if 1,000 of those people are your true fans, whether AI exists in the world or not, that's worth something, right? So I felt comfort knowing that, okay, let's just like, if in doubt where we should spend our time, let's build more distribution, because that's always going to be relevant.
So yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. The idea that maybe everyone else can now build the same thing, but they might not necessarily have access to the same audience and channels as you. There's so many threads that I want to unpick there. One that I think would be fascinating to a lot of people is that you were talking about how you mitigated the fact that you're reviewing code that might not have even been written by a human at this point, and that was really important. What does that look like? How have you solved for that to make sure that one human reviewer isn't becoming a bottleneck to the process?
Oh yeah, I absolutely name and shame people. I'm absolutely like, I'll just like, I'll see something in a spec where it's typical sort of fancy, language that Claude tends to write, and I'm just like, oh, that's an interesting use of English from someone who's like, from Serbia. I'm just like, okay, that's, I'm like, you're it's like, and it's funny, I'm just like, and I sometimes tell people like, look, you think that like, because sometimes people are like, well, actually no, like Claude writes better English than I do. It's like, no, like it actually doesn't. Like you write better English. Like I'd rather have your simplified take, which like has the real essence of the problem, as opposed to the sort of verbose and sophisticated sounding Claude's take. So that's one thing is naming and shaming. I think the other thing is just having process for it. I mean, we have a bunch of things in the process that help. We luckily with smart contracts, we already had code audits, both internally and externally. One of the things I think was unique to how we worked always was that we didn't rely on the external audits. In smart contracts, you always had external teams coming in and review the code. That's always going to happen, but it's very risky to do that without doing it internally. So we always did it internally first. We did like a week or two where we actually turn our team into security engineers, and they stop writing new code, and they basically go and explore, and they try to find bugs. And we literally have like a 18-step process, just like an auditing firm. If someone asks us to audit some code, we could actually do it because we literally try to mimic being an auditing firm. We use the same tools, we use the same language, we use the same processes, and we try to find issues in the software. It means we find, we don't find everything, but we find the low-hanging fruit, which means that now for the external auditors when they come in, well, A, they can focus on the stuff that's actually really deep, and B, they have no more low-hanging fruit, so they have to push more because otherwise this looks like they haven't found anything. So it works really well that way. But yeah, it's I'd say a mix of process and just like setting the standard that you own the work, right? Like you're responsible for your reviewing or your own work now.
The setting the standard piece, the process piece is really interesting. I think what process did the organization have in place to check the human written code before AI came along? And I think the places that are probably struggling are the ones that had no process in the first place. I think that's really interesting. Your other point about calling people out, saying, well, this is clearly written by Claude, requires you to have a familiarity with what Claude sounds like, right?
Yeah. And to be fair, I really try to avoid the wording it was written by Claude because I use Claude as well. Like I'll write some things written by Claude. So I try to focus on what is it about it that I want to change, right? So I try to focus on, and my teammates know me well enough to know that I'm basically saying this is written by Claude, but like I'm saying things like, this is I don't understand what this means, or this is like way too complicated a way to explain this, or like what do you mean? Things like that. I think always try to figure out like what is it exactly that I'm unhappy about, right? Because that's how we add value into this process, is by like actually having an opinion, right?
Yes. Yeah. There was something else you said earlier, which I think is a fun. It's like a paradigm shift that I think people struggle with, me included, which is that historically a miner might have gone down into a shaft, mined it themselves, and now a machine does it. Yeah. It's not that their way of working has changed. It's not like there's a change to their personal craft. of mining, that there is there is a machine doing it now.
Yep.
So now they become operators of this machine. Yeah, how do you? I think this is actually quite a big gap for a lot of people in terms of how they unlock their own self-learning journeys, like being able to go from an AI skeptic to actually using Claude every single day. How do you help people overcome that? How do you make them realize that there is value in them becoming the operator of the machine rather than being the person that goes down to the shift?
Yeah, the operator machine is actually a wonderful way to phrase it, because I was going to say I think the work that we all now have in front of us is like finding and eliminating the bottlenecks of this process, of spending tokens. And it's a very different type of work than just, shipping deliverables or being responsible for something. I think in terms of the importance, I think the biggest mistake people make is trying Claude for 5 minutes and saying, "Oh, phew, it's not smarter than me. Like I'm a better programmer than Claude is," right? And I think the biggest mistake people make is just assuming that it's like forgetting that it's just a tool, right? I was like, well, the people that hate AI the most are the people that sort of find this issue around comparing their intelligence against the AIs. And I'm saying, no, like you're actually right. Like it's not more human or more smart than you or whatever. Like let's just accept that's true. What if it is just this dumb little tool? Are you smart enough to figure out how to use this dumb little tool? Like, are you not smart enough to figure out how to, use it and add value from it? Like, I think that's how people should see it. It's like, yeah, you're like 10 times smarter than Claude. Sure. Great. So you should be smart enough to figure out how to use this thing, right?
Where do you think that insecurity comes from, though? Because obviously there's this, and you mentioned earlier when we were talking about the customer support stuff, right? There is this general perception that AI is going to take people's jobs. Do you think that is the primary driver?
I think there are certainly areas where AI is going to take people's jobs. I think in the short term, the biggest problem is that people who use AI are going to take people who don't use AI's jobs. And so become a person that uses AI, and then you won't have that problem. I do think even myself long term, I don't think there's like very little of what I do, maybe apart from scribbling some essays on the internet and having people feel like they know me, that AI cannot replace. And so it's entirely possible that in the long run, there's a great YouTuber who he wanted to be a space engineer. It's called BPS Space, the YouTube channel, and he applied to Tesla and he got rejected. And so what did he do? He created a channel where he basically just created model rockets. And he was like, I'm gonna just build rockets from scratch. I'm gonna learn everything about what I can figure it out about making rockets. And he just like built more sophisticated rockets. Eventually, he actually managed to land one in an automated fashion, just like SpaceX does. And then, of course, he eventually ended up getting offers from those companies. And he was like, actually, no, I kind of enjoy what I do, because now he has a YouTube channel, he has a big audience, he makes these model rockets, he sells the parts for the model rockets. And possibly see that like the bear case of my future is that I become some sort of tech influencer who's just kind of role playing being an engineer. And I just do these projects for fun, and people are just interested to follow along, and I'm fine with that. Like that maybe like I eventually just become a caricature myself. But that's very realistic kind of, floor case of like the role of humans is that we'll just all be entertaining each other. But I think there's also a bull case there, which is that you're not excited about the prospect, James. I mean, we're on a podcast, so I think you understand something.
I know. I mean, it's kind of partial commentary on what we're doing right now, and it's also, I mean, you promised an unhinged prediction, and you gave me one. So, I mean, yes,
yeah, I think,
maybe we'll just all become entertainers for one another.
Yeah, I think that's certainly an important hedge, and I think it's certainly something that's going to increase over time. Yeah, 100%. Obviously, there's like you still need yoga instructors, right, in the wild. So those people don't need to use AI. If you're a meditation teacher, it probably takes away some of your credibility if you're like, putting, Calm or Headspace on, in the room. Like you're probably not going to do that. But yeah, if you're someone who's currently, using the keyboard to produce all their output, it's possible that, you're going to find yourself in a, having spending much more of your time focused on distribution than actually deliverables over time.
Gosh, I've never actually heard it in such reductionist in such a reductionist frame. But anyone that uses a keyboard, that's actually quite stark, isn't it? I mean, anyone that uses a keyboard potentially could be replaced by AI.
Yeah, or certainly like your work could evolve, right? And like,
what's your more optimistic view of the future? What do you think? And I mean, you've been building software for decades now. Like, what does the future of software building look like when these models finally do start doing all of these things as well as the people currently doing them?
Yeah, the optimistic case is that actually, this is just like a wonderful tool that we just now have this way to turn the planet's finite resources into knowledge output. But it has like inherent limitations of what it can do. And I think we see some of those limitations, right? It's really hard to engineer taste. It's really hard to engineer creativity from AI, right? If you talk to a designer, you'll find them a lot less worried, right, than talking to a backend engineer. So I think there are fundamental limitations of what AI can do. And then you have just like other aspects of roles that, for example, product management. Like part of product management has always been understanding the user, understanding the human, right, and figuring out what they're trying to do and how to help them and so on. And so I think those aspects are probably going to be still very, very relevant, and maybe they just become much more relevant over time. So it's sort of in the past, you had companies like Apple who followed a very kind of taste-oriented strategy, and there were always a couple in a given market, but maybe they weren't dominant. It's possible that kind of becomes a primary axis of competition, right, in the future, where you just have a lot less of Google's. Like, what was Google always? Google never had taste. Like, Google was always just good at shipping a lot of software, right? They were just and they were good at solving some complicated data management problems and so on. They weren't particularly good at like innovating on their business model or things like that. And so it's possible that you kind of have a lot less room for the Googles and you have a lot more room for Apples in the future. Although ironically, Apple's struggling with AI adoption, but yeah, the point I'm making is more around, what type of work is going to be valued for humans to do. And I think it's kind of, compensating for some of the flaws of AI models.
Yeah, I really like that. I think I think a lot of the designers I work with do feel a little bit under threat, with engineers now shipping features and circumventing them by having access to a design system, things like that. But I see a similar future, which is where everything progressively becomes a bit more beige, and actually the work that stands out is the stuff that's genuinely creative, that has taste applied by a real human. And I mean, that was the thing that helped Apple win the mobile phone race, right? Is their ability to design something that was aesthetically pleasing and that people wanted to use. I think that's a really interesting frame. Let's talk predictions, right? What you've touched on a few already, but what do you think the world of work looks like with AI?
Yeah, I think so. I think one big one is that trading has always had a very interesting, traders were always just different people than the rest of us, right? It's like, it's all competitive, right? You're not sort of helping each other. You're actually competing with each other. Your performance boils down to your P&L, right? And you're in this like cutthroat environment. In many companies, you actually don't necessarily have access to a lot of great tools and things like that. I think there's a part in which our jobs may become a lot more like a trader's job.
Okay.
And this is, by the way, this is a scary thing. And I'll explain what I mean by that. If you think about AI as basically every job becomes, how much compute do I get? And how do you use that compute effectively, right? That's going to be a part of everyone's job now. everyone who has access to a Claude plan, everyone who has access to a Codex plan, part of their job is managing their token spend, right? Because they're going to have a budget. And so that is exactly like trading, right? And how are traders, like, how are they ranked on the floor, right? They each have a different, P&L. They have some way of observing like how much they're making. And as you get a better P&L, you get access to more funds to trade with, right? AKA tokens. So I do think that a lot more jobs are going to reorient around feeling more like trading, where we're going to have some observability of how performant these individuals are with their tokens. And then you're going to get bigger and bigger token quotas. So as opposed to like you becoming a VP means that, okay, you now manage 7 people instead of 3 people. It's like, no, you now manage, a budget of 500,000 tokens a year or something like that, as opposed to a smaller budget of tokens a year.
So it's a couple of interesting things there. One is, I agree. AI tokens, AI is less like a tool and more like a resource now. So it's almost the equivalent of headcount. And I do think that increasingly organizations will be thinking about at quarterly budgets, how much tokens does a budget get? How much does a leader get? How much does a team get? All these sorts of things. The trader metaphor, I think, or analogy rather, is also fascinating, but predicated on each individual having some sort of measurable outcome to determine performance, right? And that's not currently how most organizations are set up. Yep. So do you see a pivot there as well?
I do. I mean, I think because CFOs are just going to be asking this question, right? They're like, well, why is this person getting $500,000 dollars worth of tokens a year? Like, what are they spending it on? I think that we're just going to get better and better at putting metrics around those things. And, it's kind of similar to, a form of product market fit that was always very exciting for companies is when your lifetime value of a customer exceeds your customer acquisition cost, right? And basically, like, before that and after that, you're just running a completely different company. And I think the same is going to be true around tokens, where the companies that figure out how to profitably spend tokens and know that they're profitably spending tokens are going to have a huge... you're right, we don't have a language around that. We don't have the understanding of that. In the same way that, at some point in history, we didn't have an understanding around LTV versus CAC, even though it seems really simple. But I think we're going to start to build those, frameworks over time. And in certain industries, probably sooner than later. In other industries where you're, creating complicated creative projects, like it's going to be harder. You're making a movie, you're figuring out the budget of the movie and how it's going to do. I think some AI challenges are going to be like that, where, let's spend, 2 million tokens on this and we'll see how it's going to go, right? But then I think other domains are going to be more defined.
Yeah, I think you're bang on. Any other predictions?
The other prediction, this is a spicy one for McKinsey's.
The first one wasn't a spicy one.
Well, so in the context of, I think McKinsey's been around for 100 years. It's like sort of seen as a fairly enduring organization. I think there's sort of structural reasons why it could keep growing. I think this is the most dangerous moment for traditional consulting, and generally do. And I think like we may find that, I think this is, potentially the biggest existential risk to traditional consulting has ever been, for many reasons. And it could actually fail to become relevant in this world. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. I think one is that traditionally the transformation space was something that no other company wanted to play in. And so consultancies always, somebody invents something new, like, okay, hey, we can do lean manufacturing. There was always a massive pool of revenue that just went to the consultancies because nobody else was going to teach organizations how to do it, and all that stuff. And so they, in effect, like they were always extracting a major amount of value from every single massive technological or process innovation that was happening, was going to, quote unquote, the services industry, but a lot of it was going to consulting specifically through these transformations. The same was sort of started happening with AI, where, consulting companies have been very relevant in AI transformations historically. But now, OpenAI and Anthropic are creating transformation organizations. There's even SaaS tools people are creating to help with transformations, where agents are kind of running around and, doing this sort of, implementation levels and chasing up things and so on. A couple of those companies are pretty well funded. So that's very interesting. And then the second thing is that if you see consulting as a chain of knowledge work where you have a bunch of these playbooks and you have a bunch of these experts, and you basically just, get in touch with the experts in the playbooks, you do some data gathering, and then you sort of synthesize it. There's a point at which you ask the question, well, why is it not real time? Why does that take a quarter to complete a form of analysis? Is that even still relevant? There's a part where you ask the question, why isn't that intelligence part of the process of how products are being built? In general, there's a point at which it just becomes too slow, basically, and where it becomes the limit of having just a certain fixed amount of humans in a consulting company. Like, the knowledge output of that is just fairly bounded versus the knowledge output potentially of a bunch of agents that are well coordinated and doing the right things is unbounded in some ways. So I do think those two shifts are going to be really, really hard for consulting companies to go around. I think their model is just going to become increasingly less relevant.
And these consultancies, any of them feasibly could proactively be building a proprietary set of knowledge that would give a better answer in real time.
I think there's certainly a point where it's very easy to outperform what a consulting team can do. Even with the expert networks and the data.
Because their knowledge is inherently limited to the people they have within the consultancy.
I'm actually in the middle of doing a strategy project right now, and this week I was curious about funding in the AI space by category, and I just ran a bunch of workflows, found 400 companies, had an agent scan through all the funding events of those companies, and basically give me a picture of all that. And this is a piece of work that I never would have attempted as a consultant to do in 1 week myself, certainly. Nor it would have been easily outsourced as well, because a lot of times you just have to either do it yourself or figure out some way around not doing it, or trying to find a report where someone's done it, but the report is not always the exact thing you need. So you're often in these consulting engagements, you end up working with very limited, you kind of have this ideal picture of what you want, right? Ideally you want, I want to know the 20 customer segments, and I want to know the 200 competitors, and I want to get exactly how much revenue each of those competitors is making for each customer segment. And a lot of times you end up getting a 10 by 10 table with a lot of assumptions, and then you kind of make decisions from there. Well, in the world we live in, where we have agents that can potentially go and search definitely, I think you get a lot closer to that ideal table a lot quicker, and that just compounds in the value of the process, right? You get there quicker, you make decisions faster. So I think these firms are going to start competing on very different axes now.
Fascinating. So we're all going to become traders, and consulting's getting disrupted, whether they want to be or not. I'm curious, if you were to train all over again tomorrow, like if you were just finishing school, you're just finishing uni, or you were just going to uni, like what would you train to do today?
Yeah, that's a tough one, because I think a lot about it in the context of raising my son. And my personal training was I got a maths degree, and kind of what I explained to people why I'd get a maths degree, it was simply explaining that, okay, I'm not going to necessarily go into academia, or not going to necessarily get a job where I'm directly using mathematics, but it feels like something where just really complicated. If I figure out that degree, I'm probably just become quite good at learning things, and then I can just learn whatever I want. And I think that actually turned out pretty well for me. And I've always been excited to just learn new things quickly. And I think that to me feels like a core skill in this world, because it's just really hard to predict. Like it'd be, genuinely, I think there's so much, like, this is not a linear transformation, right? I think when you sort of had railroads come into play, you could maybe, the right person could have figured out what the impacts would be from that. But when you have this kind of ever, increasing scale of intelligence, it's just really hard to predict, these sort of second order effects of what could happen, right? So it's hard to really say, okay, I know exactly how the world's going to look like for 50 years on. And so therefore, but I think just like being much more adaptive and learning a lot is great. I think the second thing, I think on the distribution front, I do think it becomes, communication becomes a lot more important. And then
Storytelling.
yeah, storytelling. I think the third one is definitely kind of, taste and having an opinion, and creativity and all that. What I'm also, it's also interesting, like what role does sort of math and science and engineering play in this world, right? Because you could definitely take the stance that, oh, well, you don't need to learn how to code because Claude's going to do all the coding for you, right? And versus the opposite of that is actually you could take the stance that, well, first of all, if you learn code and algorithms, that's just a really good way of thinking about things. A lot of times I think a lot of consulting work boiled down, into planning in some ways. And I found it, like, from my experience doing algorithms, like planning was quite easy. And so I think there's aspects where math and science is still very useful, both because it's just making your brain think in a useful way that applies to other domains. And then I also do think that the intuition you build by doing something then helps you use the tool better, right? So, knowing a little bit about coding, you're probably not going to learn assembly language. Like, that may not be as relevant. But you're going to learn some really powerful higher order programming language and hopefully do some things with it. And I think that's going to be useful to at least have some intuition of what's happening under the hood when you're vibe coding, right?
Yeah, fascinating. Or we'd still end up as YouTube influencers, just doing weekly shows on our favorite hobbies.
Yeah, hence the storytelling. Yeah. I think, like, it's funny because we mock teenagers when they're all saying, oh, I want to be a YouTube influencer.
Yeah.
But they were kind of strategically right. They were right the whole time. Like, sure, like, what they meant was, I want to be doing, stupid TikTok stuff. And what they actually turns out, should be doing is, like, doing a podcast like this, right? But they were actually directionally very, very right. I think they intuitively, the younger generation always intuitively figures out what's going to matter going forward, right? And
yes.
And the previous generations figured out that, math and science is going to really matter. And the current generations, like, the fact that they're figuring out that distribution is really going to matter and social media is really going to matter, they're not wrong about it, I think.
Wow. That is an amazing hot take. And it's starting to sound very true.
Yeah.
Awesome. Peter, thank you so much. That was fascinating and hilarious at the same time.
Yeah, it's a fun world to be in, for sure.
All right. Well, next time then.
All right, later.